On June 20th, 1987, after 10 years of intense research, the Turkish government announced to the world the discovery of Noah's Ark and the dedication of it and the surrounding area as a national park. In 1977, Ron Wyatt made his first trip to this area. It was during this first trip that Ron found numerous huge drogue-style anchor stones, all the same approximate size as the one here. These were all in a direct alignment with the boat-shaped object, evidencing their being cut loose or dropped as the ark entered the area of its final rest. These bear ancient iconographic inscriptions of the 8 survivors of the flood. In 1978, temporarily unable to continue work on Noah's Ark, Ron Wyatt took his 2 sons, Danny and Ronnie, to a site in Egypt he believed might be where the Red Sea crossing took place. When they arrived at the site on the Gulf of Aqaba, they found a Phoenician-style column lying on the beach. The water had eroded away the inscription, but in 1984, Ron found a matching column on the opposite shore in Saudi Arabia, still standing, with the inscription still intact. He was later able to translate the words Pharaoh, Mizraim, Death, Edom, Yahweh, and Solomon from this second column, and from this he believes these columns were erected by King Solomon and dedicated to Yahweh for the great miracle of the crossing of the sea on dry land. Israel was occupying the Sinai Peninsula at this time in 1978 and moved this first column from the beach and set it in concrete across the road, as you can see here. Diving at this site, they filmed numerous coral-encrusted chariot parts, such as these 2 chariot wheels still attached to an axle, one wheel flat on the ground and the other in the air. This is a 6-spoked wheel. They found a vast amount of artifacts which loudly attest to the miracle which occurred here. Horse and human skeletal remains are still preserved by the coral, as are chariot cabs without wheels, wheels without cabs, some wheels on axles, and some not. He retrieved a chariot wheel hub, which he presented to Nasif Mohammed Hassan, who was the director of antiquities in Cairo, Egypt. But the most astounding find was this gold-veneered 4-spoke chariot wheel, which he was able to video in March of 1988, but he was unable to retrieve it as the wood had disintegrated, leaving only a thin gold shell. My husband, biblical archaeologist Ron Wyatt, never planned to search for these cities, but in 1989, while working on another project, he was suddenly impressed to stop and examine some odd-shaped, whitish-colored formations along the western shore of the Dead Sea. After driving past these at least 30 or 40 times in the past 12 years, this time they suddenly looked like the shapes of city walls and buildings. Pulling over, he and his crew closely examined these desolate areas. Taking samples of the material, they discovered that they broke right off in their hand and disintegrated into dust the consistency of talcum powder, as Greg Brewer shows us here. In August of 1990, Ron returned to these sites to thoroughly explore them, 5 sites which he had thus far located. About 100 yards from the entrance, upon a high level, was a singular shape. As we viewed it from all angles, we all agreed it plainly bore the shape of a sphinx. We later found more of these sphinx shapes.
Now some of them we have cracked open so you can see the sulfur inside, and others we have left intact, but there are millions of these here. So this shows that God indeed rained fire and brimstone upon these cities. And if you'll look in your dictionary, under brimstone, you'll find that it is sulfur.
On January 6th, 1982, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I broke into a chamber beneath the Calvary escarpment, north of the city wall of Jerusalem. In that chamber is the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, and several other things that I didn't see. They were covered with animal skins, with boards, and then with stones.
The fourth trip I made into this chamber, it was spotless. The furnishings were set in perfect order. The Ark of the Covenant, however, had been placed against the wall, the end of the cave. The end of the cave was a beautiful crystal radiating the colors of the rainbow.
The mercy seat has a crown molding with a bell, meaning life, and a pomegranate, meaning resurrection. This represented Jesus, our resurrection and life. One of the objects Mr. Wyatt turned over to the Israel Antiquities Authority is this small ivory pomegranate. It has an inscription around its shoulder stating, "Holy to the priests, belonging to the temple of Yahweh." This is the only publicly known object from the first temple, Solomon's temple. It is featured on an Israeli stamp next to an image of Solomon's temple. The ivory pomegranate is on display today in the Israel Museum under secure guard.
"2,600 years ago, the prophet Isaiah prophesied that Israel would become a nation in a day. And it was phrased as, has anyone ever heard anything like this? Has it ever been from the beginning of time that a nation is born at once? And yes, Israel, which had not been in more than 2,000 years, in one day, by an act of the United Nations, was born in one day. May 15th, 1948, and from that day, the archaeological finds that prove the veracity of the scriptures have been coming forth from the ground. Literally, ladies and gentlemen, the rocks are crying out. But yet, the mainstream media and the world at large wants to ignore it, wants to avoid it, because they do not want to believe that there is a God in heaven who is in control of the universe. The rocks are crying out, and we have with us the author of The Ark Secret, Jerry Bowen. He is the director of Anchor Stones International, and the field of his endeavor has been biblical archaeology. He has been involved in this for well more than 30 years, starting out as a critic, as a skeptic, and continuing to delve into the evidence. He is bringing forth so many great details, especially concerning Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark has been found in northern Turkey. It is a well-established fact that is ignored in just about all the world and will be continued to be ignored for some time. But I believe that this time is the day that these things are going to come out. The rocks are indeed crying out from the earth. And before the revealing of the Ark of the Covenant, there are things that are getting set up right now. And as Jerry and I were talking about these things, I told him that the first time I saw the evidences concerning this, concerning Noah's Ark and Sodom and Gomorrah, the Red Sea crossing, when I saw these things, I thought, why has this not gone like wildfire through the Christian church? And there's a question that I asked. I was asking heaven, why is it? And I realized it was my responsibility to help get this message out. But, I really never did that much concerning Noah's Ark because I have never been there. I've not been on the site. I've seen the evidence, not all of it, but this is a man who's been there more than 30 times, who's spent a great deal of his life and his own personal resources and the help of so many people to get this message out. But the question comes up, why did God use one man to reveal these things? Jerry, thanks for being back with us.
Yes.
And I really appreciate the work that you've done on this. And we want to hear more about Noah's Ark, more of the evidence on that. But give us your perspective of what has happened. Why hasn't why is it that one man was used for this rather than the big denomination or a school of archaeology?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question, and one that really every person should be asking that is exposed to this material. How could one person, I mean, it'd be phenomenal for one person to find even one of these sites. What I would think of would be, a whole team, a whole university team of folks would be involved, be a lot of resources behind, those individuals, etc. Why is it played out this way? That was a question that I had, and one that we should consider.
Because that's one thing. Well, how could that happen? They say because that happened, so many people think because that happened, one man found all these things, it can't be true.
It can't be true.
That's the first premise that comes up.
Yeah, that's obviously one perspective that you can take. The other perspective that I would hope that a Christian would take would be, is God in some way specifically involved with this? Is he doing something specific to demonstrate that he himself is stepping into the equation, you see? And
so it's not a denominational authentication. It's not a school that they're the greatest school on earth. And Ron, I knew him too, and he was never applauded himself, not a bit. He used every evidence that he ever got to reach the lowest of people.
Yeah, Jeremiah 9 talks about, makes the statement that, not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. Yeah. It wasn't going to be that we were so smart, we were going to find things and figure things out. It wasn't human initiative that was going to get this ball rolling about 30 years ago. It was going to be God stepping into the equation specifically, and he was going to have to make that obvious. And that's what that's the message that really has come down to me. He's made it very obvious. We know, humanly speaking, that one person could never find these multitude of things. Okay? Right, they would have to be God directed. And when you look at the evidence, you can tell that the evidence is sound enough that if you look objectively, you know that the sites are authentic. There have been a lot of traditional sites out there over the years that have been suggested. But here's physical evidence that verifies the authentic location. So you can try to look the other way, when something's in front of you. But, of course, then you're just being willingly ignorant. And that might be because you have so much invested. For example, a lot of people think that the Ark of Noah came down on Mount Ararat. Well, a lot of people have so much invested in that ideology that all of a sudden say, well, actually, we see now this evidence and we realize that this is the final resting place. Ego is involved, pride is involved, maybe economics are involved, monetary.
Hunting for Noah's Ark has become an industry for some individuals. People, donate thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to look for Noah's Ark in a place that didn't even exist in the time of Noah, and it's become a cottage industry. And the first thing they have to do is attempt to attack the real thing, because it would ruin the thing that they built, that they get to go on great vacations and live in mansions off what people have donated. Yeah.
So I think to answer your question directly, there have been a lot of folks that have a lot invested in some way in a different location, and so to all of a sudden change their perspective is maybe a little too difficult. Now, of course, we're still praying for people, and I I have an expectation. I don't have any expectation that someone's just going to accept it because I'm saying it. You have to have a healthy skepticism about some of these things. Archaeology in general is it's highly suspect because in secular archaeology, for example, you go into a dig, you go to a dig site, and you start to go down. And as you go down, you find things, you find the way things are positioned, you look at all the circumstances around that, and that begins to tell a story, right? Well, as you dig deeper, the story is going to expand. In fact, it may even change totally the further down that you dig. And some people obviously have had the integrity to when they realize that, they make the adjustments in the story. The advantage that a biblical archaeologist has is that the story has already been written. Okay?
That's right.
And so the story's already been written, and so when we come along and find things at certain locations that Scripture may verify and identify, and what those things should be, such as in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible tells us exactly what we should find even though there was a great conflagration there. When we find those things, all they're doing is verifying the story that's already been written. We don't have to really add to the story, except for maybe the spiritual significance of it. And that's an important part of course, all of what that we're dealing with. But a lot of people, of course, shy away from some of this or view it critically because they can't get past the idea that God would use one man to relocate. The stuff has always been there. And right. God has had it preserved. And now to bring it forth at the appropriate time in history, the best way to do that, to demonstrate that He alone was going to be responsible for that, was to use a single person, and a non-professional at that. He, on purpose, intentionally used a non-professional, one single person primarily, to relocate, to go, God said, go here, go here, go here. And he had miraculous experiences.
And it was literally being led by the Spirit. When you hear the testimony, and both of us, we spent a lot of time with Ron Wyatt. I mean, personally, we've heard every one of these stories, and they don't change. They're always the same because he just plain told the truth.
Exactly.
And so you hear these stories, and you hear this is a testimony of how the Spirit led him. Sure. You can't make this stuff up. And one of the things that I would say, the thing that hit me because that question came to me before anyone else said, how could one man find it? Sure. I asked that question.
Sure.
And then immediately it came. This is a man who kept the Sabbath. And see, for me, I had only at that point for a year had been keeping the Sabbath. I grew up in the grace perversion, sure. that, the commandments are, done away with basically, et cetera, all except, tithing. That's the only commandment that hasn't been done away with in my church. Right. And in going to movies and dancing, those commandments were still in effect. Mm-hmm. Those ones that came from Mount Sinai. Anyway, but for me, I saw that when I began keeping the Sabbath, it was a life-changing event that the Almighty met me there, and He took me on a path after that. And so as soon as that said, this man kept the Sabbath, then this is what Yeshua said. If you do not keep and do the commandments, if you do not do what you know, even that which you know will be taken away from you. Mm-hmm. You obey what you know, and then if you do obey, even more truth will be given to you. Sure. And so here was the immediate testimony to me. I'm to listen to this man because the Almighty can use one person who obeys His commandments, who will listen to Him, and it doesn't matter what happens to them personally. He stood his ground and said, this is what the Almighty showed me. This is how He showed me.
Yeah. And God was, of course, calling, when it comes to something, the most controversial of the sites, the Ark of the Covenant, God needed an eyewitness to that.
Yeah.
And so much easier to deal with one person in that regard than, a whole crowd of people, etc. So there are many logical reasons why God did it the way He did it, but primarily to demonstrate that He alone had basically just taken control of the situation. And of course, the other thing that's really was very remarkable, as I researched it out, was the manner in which the Lord brought these things forth. I mean, he had preserved them, of course, but the manner in which He was going to bring them forth to the general public was also quite amazing. I know when Ron Wyatt first went out there in 1977, and you may have heard the story, he didn't know where to go. He just knew. He had looked at a Life magazine article, 1960 Life magazine article, September, and they had an article in there about an expedition that had taken place earlier that year called the Vandeman Expedition. And so Ron was inspired by that, and eventually 17 years later he was compelled to take himself and his two sons, and there's even a miraculous thing there with them getting their passports in time. One of his sons, I think, got his passport in just 2 days, which is almost unheard of today. But they made the trip out there, and they didn't know where to go. They had contacted some of the remaining members of the expedition team in 1960, and they just said, well, look, we just know it's close to Mount Ararat. There are no roads, et cetera, et cetera. So it was definitely like an Indiana Jones exploration for them. And because they didn't know where to go, and still felt very compelled, the only resource they had was to trust that God would lead them. And so Ron was that kind of person, and that always impressed me, that he would ask the Lord, if you want me to find this, you're going to have to direct me. Mm-hmm. And so they did it the hard way. They went out, they landed in Istanbul, and then they took a train clear across the country to a place called Erzurum, which is still about 4 hours away from Dugulbayazit, which is the easternmost city, which is the closest to the Ark. And then they took a taxi. So they're taking a 4-hour, they're going across the country in train, which we don't do anymore, of course. And then they take a taxi from Erzurum, which is a 4-hour trip. And just as they get toward Dugulbayazit, it's starting to get, the sun's starting to lower and whatnot. They still have some light, but it's starting to get dark. And so the taxi's got his lights on and whatnot. Unbeknownst to the taxi driver, who could not speak English, so there wasn't any real communication there, Ron and the boys had prayed a simple prayer. They said, Lord, you just stop the taxi where we need to look. Now that's not scientific. That's pretty simple.
Right, and for a lot of the Christian world, they can't even relate to this because, I grew up in a Christian church, went to every Wednesday night prayer meeting for 17 years, and I never saw a miracle. I never heard anyone get anything directly from the Heavenly Father, but I knew. All you have to do is read the book of Acts. You know that the Holy Spirit can lead, and if you'll pray and ask, He will show you. And so when I heard part of this story, I related to it. I knew that Ron White was being led by the Spirit, which does not fit the book for a professional archaeologist or basically professional religionists. They don't hear from heaven because, he's trying to do the will of God, not build a denomination.
Yeah. So what was amazing is as they're driving down the road, the vehicle cuts off. And you can just imagine, I would have loved to have had a little mini cam in the back of that taxi to see their faces as that vehicle drifts off to the side of the road. And of course the driver has no clue what's going on. But Ron looks at the boys look at him, and they're going, are you kidding me? Wow, this is amazing. So they get out, and they know they're not going to be able to do any exploration, and then they pile up a pile of rocks on the side of the road. And that's the area they're going to explore. So the taxi driver tries to start the vehicle again. It starts right back up. Of course, they had gotten back in. They drive a little further down the road, and it cuts off again. And they look at one another with maybe a little less enthusiasm now, but they still get out, and they pile up some rocks at this location. They get back in the taxi, and of course the taxi driver, he doesn't understand what's happening. They go a little further down the road, and the taxi stalls again. And Michael, now they're thinking, oh, wow, we got a bum taxi. They've been driving for almost 4 hours, right? And they're close to the city itself. And that's how we are as human beings. God is directly doing something, and we start to doubt a little bit. But they got out, and they piled up some rocks.
Probably a little smaller pile this time.
Yeah, maybe so, a little smaller pile. But, and of course the taxi driver, he's beside himself. He's got the hood up. He's trying to figure out what's going on. But eventually they get back in the car, and they go on to their hotel. And then it's the next day that they come back, and they start from the first pile. They go ahead and work perpendicular to that, and they begin to find things. And of course, Ron was pretty sharp. He was pretty astute. He was well read. He wasn't a professional archaeologist. He wasn't from academia, even though he had he was a nurse anesthetist. But he went ahead.
Make good money because all this, no university is funding this. He's doing it on his own. And literally, he is researched from when the Life magazine article came out.
Sure. He's
been involved in research to finally drive him to do this act.
Exactly. And so, it was this story of, as they went back and researched these out, what's impressive about the story is that Ron went over there looking for one thing. He was looking for the remains of the ship. Mm-hmm. And God just said to him, well, as long as you're in the neighborhood, let me show you this, and let me show you this as well, the circumstantial evidence that's related. Mm-hmm. And so that story became very inspiring to me as I would learn it, not by the films that I watched at that camp meeting, but going and finding the person that was leading out and actually chatting with them for literally hours after the fact. And I spent probably that whole week, just absorbing everything that I could absorb on that research material. And that's what really motivated me to get going back in 1987, 88.
Now, what Ron first saw at where these things were stopping, he investigated, and they turn out to be the very things that your organization is named after, is it not?
Yes, one of the things, anchor stones or drogue stones, we would call them.
That's right. And so you're going to be showing us some things at this right after our break. We're going to be getting into this, but
Sure.
But these drogue-style anchor stones that were used on the ark, these massive stones, you know, as soon as I saw them, I live in the Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is right down below my house, and I have on my porch a number of anchor stones that are exactly like that. That have the holes drilled through, bored through with the knots and all that, and this is what is used, and they find these all over the place, but not at this height, not at this size. These are completely, you know, the size of them is beyond anything that we could handle, you know, the size that we are today.
Absolutely.
Of course, we didn't grow up to be, you know, 900 years old either,
right.
and be able to work on the ark for 100 years. But you're going to be showing some of these evidences as you discovered them by going back over the very places
right.
that you saw in Ron's presentation then.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right now, we're going to join Jerry on his adventure to the mountains of Urartu, where he has been more than 30 times, taken many groups over there of researchers for the evidence of the Ark of Noah. Jerry, please take us on the trip.
Okay. One of the things, of course, that one of those piles of rocks that Ron piled up next to the road led him to this area that's been called different names. In archaeology, place names have become a very important aspect of archaeology. And one of the things that's necessary to understand is that the same geographic location can be called different names. And so this area that Ron was going to, I think when he first went to, was called Saglak Suyu. And then eventually, many years later, it was called Kazan. And then now they call it Arzep. So you may have a Turkish name, you may have a Kurdish name, you may have an Armenian name. You know, you may have different names for the same geographic area.
Now in Israel, we see that very same thing.
Very same thing happening. One of the areas that of course he ended up was right here. There were a whole pile of these large drogue stones. We've found about, I'd say, 30 of them. I think when Ron initially went over, he found maybe 12 to 14. But, of course, as time has gone by and erosion has occurred in different areas, you find some standing up erect, and you find others that are just lying down in the mud.
Explain what this drogue stone is and what, you know, how this would have been used and its significance here.
One of the things that we noticed with these large stones here is the tether hole. And some people, of course, have criticized, you know, that, well, how could, you know, this thing obviously is about 10 feet in height. They're about 5 to 6 feet in width and fairly slender, maybe a foot, 16 inches wide.
And so they're fairly uniform then.
Yeah, they're designed, of course, to create drag. You attach them to the ship. If you were to attach them to the stern, it's designed to create drag in the rear of the ship so that the bow is lifted. And, of course, this would be vital. This would be of vital importance to make the ship seaworthy. Because when the bow is raised and you have wave action against the bow, it heads the ship directly into the wave instead of going broadside. Okay, so it had
which would cause a rollover.
Well, it was a potential rollover. So if you could imagine the flood was being a global flood, had to be pretty horrific, something that we've never experienced since. But you would have to have a mechanism, kind of a self-contained mechanism that would automatically head the ship into turbulence as opposed to changing it. These drogue stones were able to accomplish that. But one of the things that we noticed eventually was that as we found multiple drogue stones, we found that some had the tether hole with a center rib. So it was kind of honed out on this side and honed down on this side, and you had kind of a center rib still protruding in the middle there. And so these stones, we believe, were used to control the pitching and the rolling They were along the entire length of the hull, supported by 2 ropes coming down, one from each side like this, and the stone was fixed on that rope. So as the ship would pitch this way, you would have this swinging motion, this swinging motion under the ship perpendicular to the hull. And that would control it from severe pitching and rolling, you see. Mm-hmm. And then they had other drogue stones that we found where the tether hull was just drilled straight through with no honing. And we believe they were just secured onto the extended keels, and that created the drag in the back, which raised the bow. So you had all these kind of things. Of course, Noah and his family, I mean, God is so merciful to actually go through an experience like that and survive on a ship. Some of the testing that's been done in the wave tests in some of the controlled environments showed that the wave action would be too severe to even survive. Even if the ship survived, just the wave action, the rolling back and forth would just throw you around too much. God thought of everything, and these people were going to survive. He was going to ensure that, and so he used these drogue stones. Almost, it's the same principle like the shock absorbers in your car. You know, they just slow down that motion. Mm-hmm. In the car, it's of course up and down, but this was side to side. Mm-hmm. So pretty fascinating to design and technology.
Jerry, is there any indication as far as on these drogue stones? We understand that after the fact they may have given some kind of indication of what these are all about.
Sure. One of the things that you'll notice, your viewers will notice on some of these, they have these crosses that are etched on there. And on most of the stones, we find 8 crosses. Now, why do you think there would be 8 crosses on
Well, there were 8 people that were on the ark. Only 8 survived the flood. And
so the Bible, the Bible verifies that even despite the fact that you hear other stories to the contrary, the Bible recognizes that there were with Noah and his wife and then his 3 sons and their wives. Mm-hmm. So these were the 8 passengers.
Right. Ron, what's the significance of the placement of the crosses in these stones?
All right, Tom, this is an iconographic representation here of a man, the head of the household, his wife, his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters or daughters-in-law. And as you can see here, the 8 crosses, the ones to his left are the lady folks in the family. The ones to his right are the men folks in the family.
Do these fit the story of Noah?
They do.
To Wyatt and Fassel, these stones appear to be in direct alignment to the boat-shaped site on Doomsday Mountain.
Now, this is also, as you talk about different names for places, this is also a place called the Valley of the 8, is it not?
That's correct. This particular area where a lot of these drogue stones are found is called the Valley of the 8. The local people there don't know why. They just know that that's what it used to be called. Mm-hmm. And, of course, again, when people groups are displaced, you lose a lot of information sometimes from what had happened in the past.
Right. And they didn't do a good job video recording it all to pass on to the next generation. And so that brings us up to the question. Obviously, crosses on here have got to be from a much later date. Noah and his sons didn't get out there and chisel 8 crosses on these anchor stones.
Right.
So give us a little background of why archaeologically we would see that.
Yeah, these seem to come from the Byzantine era, which would have been the Christians would have been living in this area at that time. Mm-hmm. And they would have recognized, passed down from father to son and how things are passed down. They would have recognized the importance of these artifacts. And so eventually, not wanting that insight to be lost through history, they would go ahead and mark them with
and Byzantine-style crosses. No question about that. So,
sure.
Yeah.
And so some of them we find marked, some of them we don't. Ones that are typically in the ground that have been unearthed at a later time, they apparently were not visible to those folks at that time. But now,
I was surprised to hear that you'd found that many in later times. All I knew about is the dozen or so that Ron spoke of.
Sure. Actually, the further back west that you go, you'll find kind of a line of stones. The further back that you go, and it was as if they were floating, of course, by this time through this area, because you have a mountain ridge on each side, and so they're kind of floating down a valley. But when they hit some of these high plateau areas, these stones would bottom out, and they would just cut them loose.
Cut the ropes.
Cut them
free 'em
loose.
up.
So
Excellent.
So you see the line of stones that kind of lead you in the direction that the ark eventually ended up over about 20 kilometers south eastwardly of the peak area.
So this really was an incredible find for the vehicle to stop at these areas where for one, the anchor stones were, because this isn't anything that anyone would even imagine would be a part of Noah's Ark.
Of course, the local people currently are Kurdish, and so they're Muslim. Most all of them are Muslim in that area, and so this really wouldn't mean they recognize the historical aspect of the Christians having been there, and that's another thing that we have to be careful of. If we call too much attention to some of these things, there's a tendency for them to go missing or to be destroyed in that area. So we have to be careful, and it's nice that we've been able to go and document a lot of this evidence. This particular rock here, if you look at it closely, you'll see how it has some grooves running through it, and it's about 700-800 pounds in terms of weight, and it actually has broken off from a larger rock. And there was always some debate. This used to be up on the formation, on the side of the formation.
Okay,
of the
now
ship.
we haven't even talked about the formation yet. So
Okay,
should we talk about that or give people a background formation of what?
Well, actually, before we get to that, the reason I brought this up was because what we eventually realized is that this was a sounding stone. In other words, Scripture indicates that the floodwaters were 15 cubits above the highest mountain. And of course, the topography was different pre-flood. But how would they know that? We don't think they had electronic sonar equipment or anything of the sort. But we do believe what they had here was a sounding stone. They would be able to drop a stone down to be able to check the depth of the water. And of course, a sounding stone is something that would have no relative importance after the fact. In other words, they would just leave it on the ship itself. No sense of taking it off. You're not going to be able to use it for anything. But because of the way the grooves are structured through there, we think that this was, they had it in like a net, a rope net, and they would just lower it down, and they could even leave it in the water for an extended period of time. And so we believe that's why you had the rope put those grooves actually in this particular rock being down there. But it's a way that they could tell how deep the water was. It was a way they could tell when to cut off, because one area they cut off quite a few of the drogue stones in one particular area. It probably just stopped the ship in its tracks, and God probably said, I don't want it here. I want you further on. And he got the message to them somehow, and they were able to cut those things loose. But some people would say, well, the tether holes in these stones are too close to the top. Some of them are fairly close to the top, and of course some portions have been broken off, so you don't have the complete stone there. But of course you have to remember, when you put a stone, even a heavy one like that, it's not designed, when you put it in water, it's buoyant to a certain extent, and its only purpose is really to ski, what I call skiing in the water. As the ship is moving forward, that is just designed to create some drag. It's not designed to really hold the weight of it. Now, if you put a rope on it today and picked it up from the tether hole, it would probably break off because you're trying to pick the entire weight up. But in the water, where you have the buoyancy, it would work just perfectly. You see? There have been other folks that we don't find any drogue stones anywhere in the world with the distinction that these have. The honed tether holes, the crosses etched on them, the 8 crosses etched on them, etc.
Right. Yeah, this is unique
they're
to the
very
area. It's
unique.
only right there, and which is all in line with what was then later discovered as the petrified remains of the Ark.
Sure.
So really, you put it all together. If you want to look at one individual piece, people can try to find an explanation for it, but you just put a couple of pieces together, you can't describe it any other way. And as far as drogue-style anchor stones, anchor stones like this They exist all over, but not of this size, not anything that we have there.
Yeah, I found one in a small town going further west. Actually, if you keep going west from Dugobizet, or from Arzeb, you'll run into Lake Von. And I ended up finding a stone close to that area that was about 17 feet in height, and it was about 8 to 10 feet wide. So that could have been the anchor stone, because it was twice as large as some of these larger stones that we find, you see. But and again, there probably are other things out there. The remains of the ship was over 500 feet in length, and so if you had stones all along the hull underneath that would hang down, it's a good possibility there are more than 30 out there. We just haven't had an opportunity to find them. So it's just fascinating that God would insert this kind of technology onto this ship.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people have the idea that back then they were an ancient, dumb culture, but we see in the book of Genesis that Tubal-Cain was an instructor of every artificer of brass and iron. These are man-made alloys, and this is right back in the very beginning. They were not as slow as we are.
And the environment was actually pristine for that kind of metallurgy as well.
This is a 39-pound copper axe head. Swing a 10-pound sledge for 20 minutes and tell me how you'd like to swing a 39-pound axe head. This is a stone that I've heard was designed to be held between the thumb and finger for chipping. I think there's a lot of evidence there were giants in the earth in those days. Have you ever gone up or down a hill, and you hear your ears pop from the air pressure change? When I climbed Mount Rainier, I got up around 12,000 foot. I've been at sea level for years now. Here I am at 12,000 foot. I thought, where's all the air up here? I was having to take 2 breaths in order to take 1 step. I go, it's real thin up there. Well, if you doubled the air pressure, breathing would be easier. And if you increase the oxygen content, that greatly helps again. I think the pre-flood world probably had greater air pressure and increased oxygen. Now, what happens under those conditions? Not only does your hemoglobin in your bloodstream take on oxygen, your plasma will get oxygen saturated, which means you could run for hundreds of miles without getting tired. Adam and Eve didn't need a car. They could run to Grandma's. Only they didn't have a grandma. Or a mother-in-law, by the way. That's why it was paradise. No. Actually, my wife had a great mother-in-law.
That's right.
Because you had greater oxygen, greater pressure, etc. So the environment was better suited for that kind of activity.
Instead of hitting senility at 60 years of age, they were in their prime at 600, 800, 900 years of age. That's how long they were living.
Before the flood, the Bible says the people lived to be over 900 years old. Now, there's one guy that travels around the country. He claims he's a creationist, but he says, now, folks, they didn't really live to be 900. They counted every month as a year. That's an even bigger miracle. Enoch was 65 when he begat Methuselah. 2 of these guys were 65. Let's see, if you divide that by 12, he's 5.5 when he became a daddy. I don't think so, no. They really were living to be 900, and they were getting bigger.
Yeah, if you really analyze it, we're just about 10%. Humanity today is about 10% of what existed pre-flood, before the flood. In age, longevity, they were living over 900. We're fortunate if we make it to 90, 95, 100 years. They were 10 times that. They were 10 times the mass. Where we might be 200 pounds, they were easily 2,000 pounds in mass.
Here's me by Robert Wadlow, tallest man in this century, 8'11" and a quarter. Had a size 37 shoe. Pretty good understanding. Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. Makes him just a little taller than Robert Wadlow. We would consider 9 feet tall gigantic. But I think before the flood, they might have got bigger than that. Here's a skeleton of a man found in a coal mine in Italy, 11 feet 6 inches tall. Well, long, not tall. He's laying down now. 11'6". How would you like to have that guy on your basketball team? Hey, throw the ball to Herman. Okay, Herman, drop it in right there. Okay, now come on back here and block off the whole court. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks don't realize the Roman Emperor Maximus was 8'6". That's where we get our word maximum from, or Maximus's boot. He was a big boy. You know, a skeleton 9 feet 8 inches tall was found in Brewersville, Indiana, back 100 years ago. Skeletons 9 feet tall found in Nevada. You don't hear about those in your public school, do you? Huge bones, similar in every respect to man's, were found embedded in thick layers of clamshells. As many as 20 skeletons were found. Every skeleton was fully 9 feet high, back in 1902, in Louisiana. A skeleton 10 feet tall found in Humboldt Lake, Nevada. In Walkertown, Indiana, 8 giants ranging from 8 to 9 feet long, all wearing heavy copper armor, were found.
They were 2.5 times larger, which accounted obviously for a lot of that mass. And then
and a lot of these the pre-flood giants, the remains have been found. As a matter of fact, you've got some things to show us. You actually have some digits of these pre-flood.
Yeah, you want to take a look at those now?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. All right. Maybe before we even look at that, well, yeah, let me show you this here. This is a piece of petrified coral. Okay. And
yes.
Where does coral grow?
Underwater, in the sea.
Coral grows in the sea, and it takes about a year for it to really develop to any significant size. And when you go into this particular area, all over this area, you're at about, not in Arzep, but over in the area where the Ark remains are, you're at about 6,000 to 8,000 feet, 9,000 feet when you get up to...
close to 2 miles.
Oh, yeah.
Start with one. Over one up to 2,000, up to 2 miles.
Yeah. Truckloads. I mean, literally, it's no exaggeration, truckloads of this stuff all over the area at 8,000, 9,000 foot elevation. That area, I mean, what the evidence shows and reveals is that that area was covered for over a year with water. Okay, and just again, it's just the physical evidence, the keys that help us to understand that. Lots of coral over there. This here is very fascinating. One of the things that, of course, occurred in the area of Arzep that Ron went to initially, not only did he find the large drogue stones there that caught his attention immediately, but one of the other piles of rock led him directly to what he believed was Noah's post-flood home. You know, he lived 350 years after the flood. Okay, and so obviously he would be building and living, surviving, growing things, and doing husbandry, raising cattle and so forth. Well, in that same area where you find an altar, and again, we've got, I think, some pics of that. Yeah, here's one of the areas here. You can see the size of this person standing on it as compared to somebody that would be 2.5 times larger. It would be a perfect height for somebody that was much larger to do their sacrificing. We believe that that's one of the things that Noah, of course, would do immediately after he exited the ark. He ended up sacrificing to God. Again, Ron never intended on looking for this, never even entered his mind or his thinking, but God piled some rocks up, stopped the cab, and this is the area that it led him to. And, he of course, found a home site. Now, we don't know 100% if that was a home site or if it was just a shrine that was erected after the fact. But
yeah, because we know Byzantine Christians were in the area. They recognized it. So we see the Garden Tomb area where Byzantine markings are there at the Garden Tomb in Israel. So we know that these places that were recognized in antiquity, they did something to mark them so that, not only was I there, but this is what this is all about.
Sure. And there were some other things that Ron found in this particular area. There was, in fact, what he was told after doing a survey of the area, because he found some walls that were about 14 feet in height that were covered with blue tiles, and on the tiles was a mural of the boat, the ship, okay? And of course, today, when you go to that area, most all of that wall has been torn down, and the tiles in the mural, it's all gone. But fortunately, Ron was there to see it firsthand in '77. The other thing was that was of astounding report is he found the grave markers where apparently Noah and Mrs. Noah were buried in that area. And unfortunately, I guess it's unfortunate that when he did some ground penetrating radar in that area, he detected some gold in certain locations. And when he turned that information over, I guess what his motive was, he was thinking, perhaps we could go ahead and get these exhumed, and now we have physical evidence of the size of the people and so forth before the flood. But I guess because of the corruption that exists in some of those areas, after Ron leaves, at some point, some of the locals were hired to come in and actually dig up that area. And what they found, Michael, was a sarcophagus, a stone sarcophagus that was 18 feet in length. And that, of course, is quite unusual today. And inside that was a skeletal remains that were about 15 feet in length. Right? So again, the people before the flood, this was obviously it was either Noah or his wife, and we've come to think because of the crown, the decorative crown on the head, and of course he had a bonnet, a jeweled crown, a bonnet. We believe that was Mrs. Noah. And the people that of course exhumed that, they were only after the treasure, but the real treasure was the remains that ended up scattering everywhere. They had, it's not surprising to go over into a hotel over there in Dogobayazit, in a hotel lobby, and see different things displayed. And in some of those hotels, we found large jawbones, much larger than ours today, and skulls and things of that nature.
This is a skull from Winnemucca, Nevada. They finally took it down a few months ago because so many folks were stopping because of my seminar saying, hey, I want to see the giant skull. But there was a giant human skull on display for quite some time. This is a normal human thumb bone. Underneath is a giant human thumb bone. This was found right near Mount Ararat in Turkey. The government of Turkey claims they have found the grave of Noah. It's a thigh bone. We've got in our museum in Pensacola a replica of a thigh bone, 47-inch femur, indicating the man would have been about 13 feet tall. That's pretty big. There's a jawbone in a hotel in Turkey on display right now, 6.5 inches across the TMJs. Any one of you could put your head inside and rattle it back and forth inside the jawbone. In Wasaki, Wisconsin, 100 years ago, giant skeletons were found in a burial mound. One of the skulls was 3 times the size of ordinary humans. The Bible says there were giants in the earth in those days. I think it says that because there were giants in the earth in those days.
Of course, a lot of the smaller bones were left right there at the site after they hauled off the sarcophagus, and this is one of them here. And this is been identified. It's been identified through a radiologist, and of course you can even see the marrow here. This is the marrow, and this has been identified as the middle phalange bone. So anybody that has any medical training realizes that in your hand, your fingers have 3 phalange bones here. And this is the middle one here, and you can see the difference, about 2.5, 3 times the size.
That looks, it's, I'm under 6, I'm 5'9", and that is 3 times the size of mine.
Yeah. So the Scripture, of course, records that there were giants in the land, of course, during that time. I don't think a lot of people have understood that really what he was indicating there was that the whole planet was just part of that environment. The people were larger, the animals were large. In the archaeology record, we find remains of large animals, beavers the size of black bears, 400 or 500 pound beavers.
Fossil cattails have been found 60 feet tall. Fossil donkey found in Texas, 9 feet high at the shoulder. Everything's bigger in Texas. Fossil buffalo horns have been found, indicating buffalo used to get huge. Show me home where that buffalo roams. I'll show you a wreck. Deer antlers, 12-foot span. Some of you hunters are thinking, wow. How many folks here go try to shoot Bambi's daddy? Come on now, let me see. There we go. And eat them too. Amen. All right, good. Kangaroo fossils have been found that are 10 feet tall. Wombats the size of a mini little car. They found in a prehistoric goose stood as tall as an elephant and weighed half a ton. That's a big goose. Fossil beavers have been found 8 feet long. Right here in Wisconsin, a guy found a beaver jaw over in Johnson Creek, Wisconsin. I met the guy. There's his phone number, Jim Erb. He said, yeah, that beaver would have been 7 or 8 feet long. That's a big beaver. In Ohio, a 6-foot beaver skeleton was found. I think before the flood, the trees were bigger, which means you need bigger beavers to chew them down.
And of course, if you have big beavers, you need bigger trees. And so the trees were, probably some of them 600-700 feet in height. All of nature was much larger. The fruit, the trees, the vegetation, the animals, the people. The world was like a hyperbaric chamber. Greater oxygen. We've done some experiments with the bubbles in the amber, and the oxygen level was at least 35%, probably greater than that, maybe 40, which is twice of what it is today, you see. So greater pressure, greater oxygen, and you end up with a bigger world, bigger nature.
A friend of mine in Oregon has his own hyperbaric chamber, cost $250,000. He let me go in it for 6 times. They call it a dive. You sit in there, they close the door, and they pressurize it. I got up to triple atmospheric pressure. After about an hour in there, all your plasma is saturated with oxygen. I got out. I felt like running around the world. I couldn't believe it. Felt like I was 19 years old again. Like, man, let's go jog someplace. It's incredible, the energy level. Dr. Mori, Ki Mori, in Tokyo, Keio University in Tokyo, started raising a tomato plant under pressurized carbon dioxide, so I've heard, and filtered sunlight. He blocked out the UV light. His tomato plant grew a little faster than normal, and it kept growing and growing and growing. And they said, wow, this thing's getting bigger. After 2 years, it had produced 900 tomatoes and was 16 feet tall. They moved it to a shopping center, built scaffolding to hold up the branches, and it kept growing and growing. They took it to Expo 85 and said, this plant might produce 10,000 tomatoes. It ended up growing 40 feet tall, producing 15,000 tomatoes in its lifetime. One tomato plant. That's a tomato tree. Now, this was a cherry tomato plant. You know, the little cherry tomatoes you put on your salad. But his tomatoes were coming off baseball size. Can you imagine if the whole world had hyperbaric conditions like that before the flood came? The plants would grow like crazy. You would need the dinosaurs just to mow the grass.
Well, we're just beginning. Now, Shosh, we have something else here that's indicative of this Noah and his family here.
This is it.
Oh, that's right. Okay, now here we go. Now we're starting to get into the edifice itself. What's the remains up there?
Sure. Okay. What we've got on the screen here is an aerial photograph that was taken during 1959. You probably heard of the Gary Powers incident where he was shot down, where he was taking high altitude surveillance of that area. And this is one of the photos here. And when the cartographers were looking at it locally in that area, they said, wow, this was Captain de Rupenaar. That's why it's sometimes called, that area is sometimes called the Rupenaar site. But Captain de Rupenaar was looking at this photo and he said, wow, that looks like a ship. And so they sent this over to a foremost authority in photogrammetry, and that was Arthur Brandenburger at Ohio State University. And he got to looking at it and he said, wow, he said, in all my years, I've never seen a photo that looks more convincing. This is definitely a ship. But what is it doing in the mountains? And so once word started getting around to certain circles, there was quite an interest in this particular location. And a year later is when a team of people, Brandenburger being included, Captain Drupenar being included, where they all, I think it was maybe a dozen people, ended up going out to the site. Now, they didn't have any roads, just going over to a military base and being led out by horseback, which is what the Vandeman expedition did. They went to a military base at the foot of the mountain, and horseback took them the rest of the way up there. So, so this occurred in 1959, this photo. In 1960, they had an expedition out there, and then 17 years later, Ron is looking for this same location here. And he finds it after God had marked it with that pile of rocks where he stopped the taxi. And Ron finds this site out there.
Do you believe Noah's Ark actually existed? Could the legend that sounds like a fairy tale really become proven fact? Well, the search has been going on since biblical times. And in a moment, you're going to meet some people who are positive they have found the Ark. Now, we know such claims have been made before, but a few months ago, these people came to 2020 with some new and intriguing scientific findings. We followed them to the mountains of eastern Turkey, and what you'll see is a bizarre adventure with a host of unlikely characters. Tom Jarrell's story takes many twists and turns.
Consider, if the biblical story of creation is fact and not fable, then the theory of evolution is all wet. A confirmed discovery would be the greatest archaeological find of all times and provide for religious fundamentalists hard evidence of the Bible's absolute reliability. Thus, Noah's Ark has become the most controversial artifact ever recorded by man.
In 1977, Ron Wyatt made his first trip to this area. It was during this first trip that Ron found numerous huge drogue-style anchor stones, all the same approximate size as the one here. These were all in a direct alignment with the boat-shaped object, evidencing their being cut loose or dropped as the Ark entered the area of its final rest. These bear ancient iconographic inscriptions of the 8 survivors of the flood. In December of 1978, an earthquake in this highly remote area dropped the soil from around the formation, allowing Ron to see for the first time the rib timbers and deck support timbers visibly exposed on the sides. A large crack was also formed along the entire length of the object, and he was able to measure the depth and take samples for analysis. The analyses showed a very high organic carbon content consistent with ancient wood. Later metal detection surveys and subsurface interface radar showed an incredible man-made structure encapsulated within the formation. Keels and keelsomes, bulkheads, decks, and even partitions between the cages became visible through these scientific devices.
The boat-shaped site was first found and photographed by a Turkish army captain back in 1959. It was quickly explored and dismissed as a freak of nature. But Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist, rekindled interest in it a few years ago. He brought in Dave Fassel, a marine salvage expert, to assess it. The Doomsday Mountain team brought in some high technology to explore the oldest legend of man. They began scanning their site with a molecular frequency generator. It's a device used by surgeons to pinpoint cancer tumors, and it's been used by Fassel to locate underwater treasure. This time, the molecular frequency generator began to pick up a unique pattern of iron lines beneath the earth.
Okay, bring that one up.
They began placing ribbons along those lines. The finished shape, outlined by the ribbons, was that of a huge ship, the approximate length and width of Noah's Ark, as described in the Bible. The fascinating field of ribbons soon attracted higher academic interest.
That looks like iron. Okay.
Dr. John Baumgartner, a physicist with Los Alamos Laboratories, sent samples back to the lab for analysis and confirmed that the metal they were tracing with the ribbons was indeed iron. With the width and the length known, the only remaining question was depth. By locating the depth of the hull, they could determine if the boat-shaped object had the cargo capacity described in the biblical ark. To resolve this final issue, Wyatt and Fassel brought geologist Tom Finner to Turkey with his company's heavy-duty subsurface radar equipment. Gear like this located the black box cockpit recorder on the floor of the frozen Potomac River after the Air Florida crash.
Suppose this rock were a foot or 2 feet underground. Would it give you a reading as to where that was? Could you locate it?
Yes, we could.
Is it possible that there will be a moment at which you will say, this is a man-made object?
The symmetry of the feature suggests it's a boat. I hope to prove that the underground structure is in fact that of a boat.
Indeed, there is something beneath that rock besides rock. A radar device developed by Geophysical Survey Systems in Hudson was used on the mountain. The device, called SIR, is used by energy exploration companies to analyze what's below the Earth's surface. According to SIR, something man-made is under Mount Eridog.
This data does not represent natural geology. It's a man-made structure. These reflections are occurring very periodic, too periodic to be random natural type interfaces.
Yeah, this gives you, this shot right here gives you a before and after the 1978 earthquake. You know, once Ron ended up going there, he saw something similar to the top photo. That's what he looked at first. And then he was praying, you know, Lord, what can we do with this? How can we more definitively reveal that this is the remains of that massive ship? And so while contemplating all of that, I guess God decided to do his own excavation and caused an earthquake in 1978, which dropped the soil significantly. One of the things...
Yeah, everything right from the sides of the ship literally fell off to where they could see the petrified rib timbers on the side of it even.
We did happen to do kind of a topical excavation here where we just scraped the matrix. So we scraped the matrix off of this, and what it revealed, because every winter you have, this is in the northern hemisphere, so every winter you have snows covering this, and you have, of course,
frost,
ice and rain, frost. Yeah, so you have frost wedging taking place, and so a little bit of this every year starts to disintegrate and fracture. But when you scrape off the matrix, get all that loose stuff off of there, this is what you end up with here.
So we see
very definitive.
Light and dark, vertical, right down the side
rib timbers.
Of, there are the rib timbers and the sides. I mean, it would take 100 years to do the excavation that the Almighty did in, what, 5 seconds? Oh. And here it is. Oh, this is amazing. This is a shot of a young Ron Wyatt.
Yeah, Ron Wyatt. And you can still see, this is not long after the earthquake, you can still see where it cracked the center down here. Center crack from that outcropping there. But it came all the way from the door area is up here on the starboard side near the bow there, and just kind of ran down there. That also provided him access to the depths. He was able to lower some things down through that crack and take some samples of things. So.
And he brought up some petrified animal dung from way down in the depths of it, which I've handled. I've actually tasted it, and it tastes nothing like petrified animal dung.
Yeah, and here's a piece there.
Oh, there it is.
Coprolite.
It's beautiful. It's like a rabbit or deer. I don't know what it would have been, that size, but there it is. That is actually from the Ark. Then.
Well, see, that's another issue that people bring up with the whole story itself. How could Noah and 7 other people take care of all these animals, all these multitude of animals, etc. And, of course, if I were there, if you were there, you would say, Lord, bring me young animals, that are going to sleep more, they're going to mess less, and smaller. In other words, it didn't take a rocket scientist for anybody to say, I want the small animals. And, of course, then after that year of riding around on the boat, once they're let out, they're going to grow and mature. They're going to be strong animals that grow and mature, you see. So, yeah, you'd want to have animals.
And it would have been relatively dark. It's almost a hibernation chamber.
A hibernation, sure, exactly. So, no issues with that at all. Now, this thing's pretty good size. In a lot of Bibles, you'll find a reference that it's 450 feet. People thinking that, the Bible mentions 300 cubits. And so, they're thinking, just an 18-inch cubit. And I understand that.
Right, but that's not the cubit that's used in the Bible. I mean, the gates of Gezer, Gezer, and Megiddo all measure out in exactly the 20.62-inch divine cubit. And Solomon was one that built those, and so...
Right.
So we're given the dimensions, and this is also called the Royal Egyptian cubit. It's really the divine cubit is what it is.
Good morning. I was just wondering how the size of the structure compared with the dimensions in the Bible.
Okay, Moses was educated in Egypt. We're told that in the New Testament and also in the Old Testament. And the Royal Egyptian cubit, which he was familiar with and we believe used in the giving the dimensions of the ark, is 20.6 inches, and 300 of those is exactly 515 feet, and that is the length dimension of the boat. The boat has splayed some, and this is to be expected in an aging boat. So the width is a little greater than that specified in the Bible, but you figure the degree of splaying and you come up with very close measurements, very similar to those in the Bible.
Yeah, and actually there are several that have existed in the ancient world, the Royal Egyptian cubit being the one of them. But of course Moses was educated in Egypt. We believe he's the one that wrote the account of Genesis. And being educated in Egypt, that would have been the one he was most familiar with. And that's the one he would have used to record the story for us, you see.
And that in the Great Pyramid of Giza, that Royal Egyptian cubit is well documented. There's no question of the length of that.
The other thing that Ron eventually realized was that the ship was full of metal. You mentioned earlier last week that they had the ability to fabricate metal, tubal cane, back in Genesis there. And not a lot of folks have really understood that the ship had to survive just a horrendous storm. And so one of the things that was used was huge metal rivets. Let's see if I can find a picture of one. That's just a small piece of one there.
Our last trip out there this past June, we found this very impressive rivet. And if you'll notice here, the plate itself is just a little more than 1/4 of an inch in thickness. It's approximately 3.5 inches in diameter, the plate itself, and then the shaft of the rivet is roughly 1 inch to 1.25 inches in diameter. And if you'll notice here, it was struck while it was hot and flared out the end of the shaft so that it would not slide back through the hole in this washer. And this shows that their abilities to use metal was quite advanced, quite sophisticated, and folks, there are thousands of these rivets on this boat. In fact, at every joint where the wooden structures are held together, they're held together by large metal plates which are predominantly iron, and then these rivets.
This is a picture here that I'm putting up now of some of the drogue stones that we talked about last week. Give you just your viewers an idea how they would have been fashioned. They probably would have been connected one to the other, so it would have been a collective that was moving back and forth. Truly what we have there at the site is we have an ark wreck. I mean, we have a shipwreck there is what we have. And this photo here gives you an idea from some of the radar scans and so forth where the main keels are and how the formation has splayed out. And I know we only have probably just a minute or two left, but maybe in the next segment we could go ahead and talk a little bit more about this splaying, because with the splaying here that you notice, this makes the formation wider than the specifications in the scriptures.
Yeah.
The length, what's amazing to me, having also a construction background, is that the ship landed higher up the ridge, and it was pushed down about 1.5 miles down the ridge to the current location that it's at. And so what's incredible to me is that the length, the integrity of the length, has been precisely maintained. And what that says to me is that these main keels must have been from one solid timber. But of course, we're talking about a ship that's 515 feet long. So how do you get beams? How do you get wooden beams that are 515 feet long?
Yeah, got to be at least 550 feet long.
For trees.
Yeah.
And some people might, again, think that that's very unusual. But again, the sequoias in California today, they get up to about 350 or so. You know, so it's not out of the realm at all for a pre-flood tree to grow twice that size.
Right, absolutely.
So we're talking a little bit about how the ship is a little bit wider. The remains that we find there today are a little bit wider than what the Bible specified. And there's a reason for that. What we believe happened is that the top decks actually collapsed onto the lower decks, and this would have occurred potentially as it came down the mountainside, even though the length was maintained because of the keels. It must have had some shifting and whatnot, and the decks collapsed onto the lower deck. Well, this caused the sides to splay outward, and as you see here in the photo.
And that splaying can account for every bit of the additional width, whereas the stem to stern is exactly in the 20.62 Royal Egyptian or Divine Cubit.
That's correct, Michael. Now, one of the things that we've done, we've had some structural engineers on the site, and when you do a satellite overlay of the formation, and then you go ahead and with your computer place the dimensions that the Bible indicates, you can see how on the right-hand side how it overlays there. Now, what happens is when you then run the degree of splaying, when you look at the way something would fall out, the angle, the arch, what you end up seeing is that it splays out exactly. This is physical data from the site, from a structural engineer, of the splaying is precisely what it should be based on the height of the original walls.
Right.
They just basically fell out.
Because we have all those dimensions in the Scripture.
Right, exactly. So again, it's just another verification that even though people would criticize and say, well, that's not, the 30 cubit wide or 50 cubit wide that the Bible mentions, once you run the analysis on the splaying aspect, then it actually is the exact figure. In other words, if you put those walls back up, they're going to be 50 cubits in width.
So, hearing the evidences and what you've had to go through as far as these different proofs and the mathematics involved and all, every one of these is because this has been attacked by someone. It can't be because this, can't be because of that. And so every one of these things that you go back to, it comes out with, no, this is the exact proof. If it hadn't splayed out, if it hadn't broken out at this degree, if it hadn't done that, then it would not be as wise as it is now, if it had remained intact. But it didn't remain intact. It's all there. So, we continue to run into this thing, and it reminds me of what Josiah, who was the director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, which is the Rockefeller Museum. I mean, honestly, that's what it is. They paid for the thing, and Rockefeller wanted to go see it. He wanted to know where all of his money went, but it's a humanist organization. It's a God-rejecting humanist organization. You go through the front door, and they've got artifacts 33,000 years ago from man. Well, that's completely ludicrous, but that's their position. Josiah refused to look at the evidence of Mount Sinai in Arabia, where the Bible says it is, in the ancient land of Midian. Refused to look at it. He said, Mount Sinai is a literary invention. It will never be found. He refused to look at it because he had already determined that the Bible is a fairy tale, a literary invention. No one will ever find it, so we're not going to even look at it. And this is what we're dealing with. Most of the world, they want to deny that there is a God. They already have their theology made up, and now we've got to recreate the world and give a different worldview and try to explain how we are here, what life is all about, because there is no God that we ever have to answer to, and we can live by our own fairy tales. And this is the kind of thing that you're having to deal with in these proofs to show that, no, whatever you come up with, whatever scientific thing you think you can use to dismiss this is what's coming back and telling us in the real world. The Almighty did interrupt the course of human events, period. Doesn't matter what you want to believe in your fairy tale world of evolution.
Yeah. You always, of course, have your skeptics out there no matter what evidence you reveal to them. Now, I see...
Yeah, I mean, it's, can you imagine demons saying, well, I guess they got us on this one? No. The father of lies will continue to manufacture lies forever.
Yeah. I see it somewhat in a positive light, though, because it really, when the criticism comes, it causes you to really do your homework.
That's true.
You see?
And that,
so
that 30 times over to this site, huh?
Yeah, I see it somewhat as a positive thing. For even with the accusation that, the ship is up on Mount Ararat.
That's the seductive beauty that brings them here, snow-capped Mount Ararat. The explorers looked for the Ark there since that's the highest point around here. And as the floodwaters receded, presumably that's where it would have landed. But the Bible describes the mountains of Ararat, mountains plural. Is it possible that the Ark came to rest on one of the smaller sister mountains to Ararat? Such a theory is abhorrent to the old-time fundamentalist, the true believers who are unbending in their faith, that the Bible was referring only to Ararat as the Ark site.
Have you ever seen anything like this? Look at the grain in this thing. It almost looks like wood.
But now there are fundamentalists who are contradicting that claim. They are the new believers. Ron Wyatt and Dave Fassel believe they have found the Ark on a slope of what the local people call Doomsday Mountain, some 15 miles south of Mount Ararat. Their Ark fever is fueled by expeditions on foot, deep into the surrounding valleys. Here, following a local Kurdish villager who drew maps on his palms, Wyatt and Fassel have made what they consider exciting and important discoveries. Apparently old Armenian tombstones that commemorate the survival of Noah and his family.
Same kind of strange stones. When the early Christians found these things, they carved 8 crosses on there for the 8 survivors. This whole valley was known as the region of 8.
The accusation that, the ship is up on Mount Ararat. I mean, just think about it. For how many centuries now, all of that activity has been going on up there, actually, in a sense, protecting the very obvious location just 20 kilometers away.
Mm-hmm.
So with all of the interest and activity and digging around and probing around and whatever they were doing up there, they weren't over there doing it to the actual formation. And so, in a sense, that became a positive thing, even though it sends an incorrect message, and we know scientifically, biblically, and even from a common sense standpoint. Can you imagine going through a flood of horrific proportions that Noah and the family went through, and then sticking you up on a 17,000-foot mountain and saying, "Okay, you guys, just get on down any way you can." I mean, it's a treacherous mountain. People die. Most people die that climb mountains for coming down, not going up. And, just 1 out of every 10 that climbs Everest, they die on the way down. And so I can't imagine God putting those individuals through that experience and then basically sticking them up on top of a mountain and saying, "Okay, you haven't been through enough, but now you got to get down." That's to me, that's not common sense. That's not logic. We see here on the screen there, just the top picture there is pretty much what the radar identified in terms of what's actually sitting there, and then the bottom photo is kind of a reconstruction of those splayed walls that would have gone up to the appropriate size. Quite a big ship, actually. This is an interesting shot here. This is a 15-foot model that Ron actually built, and took it out and put it on the river. And put it up, created some waves and that kind of thing. Pretty.
Did he utilize the drogue anchored stone devices in this?
They did put some drogue stones on there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that's when they found that keeps it the prow facing into the waves.
Correct.
And,
correct.
Oriented correctly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron did some research when he was in Hawaii. He was looking to see, he built kind of a harbor out of just regular rock in the water.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And then he went ahead and took a floating object to see where it would actually go to and how it would maneuver and so forth. So he was always kind of a hands-on guy. He'd like to experiment with things like that. so that he would have some justification for making the conclusions that he came to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I found he did so many practical experiments like that, such as some of the things that he saw in the hieroglyphs down in Egypt. He looked at those and saw that can be made; those very things can be made into a lever system, and so he built a lever system and put a car on it. And two guys raised an entire vehicle up with that very thing that he saw, and the vehicle weighed more than the stones to build the pyramid.
Sure.
So he found exactly how you'd go from one level to building it up just because the images were already there in Egypt.
Yeah.
But he had to build it in order to see this. And we saw that it was very practical in many ways like that. It says, this is what it says, this is evidence we have, let's try it out. And so, he basically, everything that he earned in his life, he spent to show that the Bible is true, that it makes sense, it adds up.
Yeah, he invested practically his whole life into this research.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we want to take a look at, this is when they were over there doing some subsurface radar for one of the television companies in Turkey and for the governor. They had a big ceremony there. During that ceremony of the opening of the visitor center, or not the opening, but I mean the commencement to actually build it. That ceremony, they demonstrated the radar, and Ron showed that just below the surface, a couple of feet below the surface, was just a portion of a deck timber. And so the governor instructed one of the military personnel to go, one of the soldiers, to dig it up, and they dug it up and actually gave it to Ron to take to the States to have it tested. And of course, this is that very timber right here. You see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was sitting in his living room when I went to visit him, and that is gopher wood, is it not?
Yeah, the Bible calls it gopher wood, and of course, I've never heard of a gopher tree, right? But so a lot of people speculate as to what the gopher wood really was. And just as the people before the flood had the ability to fabricate metal, they also had the ability to create plywood, to laminate, to make laminated wood.
The governor of Ari had Ron demonstrate the radar. When he found what looked like a broken timber near the surface, the governor had it dug up and gave it to Ron to be verified. The lab test revealed organic carbon. It was petrified wood. But the final proof was when it was sectioned. The evidence was obvious. Not only could the internal wood structure be seen, it was also clearly laminated wood. 3 separate layers could be seen. The adhesive material, or glue, had seeped out and hardened on one end and was perfectly aligned with internal layers.
Now, what I brought here, Michael, I just brought a sample. This is a sample of gopher wood. It's just different sections of wood glued together. That's what gopher wood is. It truly means laminated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
And so the deck timbers would be laminated. Now, what do you think the reason for that would be as compared to, say, a solid beam of this size?
Well, it's going to have far more tensile strength, and that's why you have joists and rafters made on this thing.
Sure, very
Floor
good.
joists and all.
Yeah, it actually would. When you cross the grains, of course, you're doubling the strength, basically, of the pliability and the strength of that board. Mm-hmm. So a lot more durable to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's just interesting that, again, the Lord would instruct Noah, the master builder, to use that kind of process instead of a solid piece of wood.
Yeah.
Now,
we see this, as far as the technology. Yeah, it was Josephus said that the Great Pyramid of Giza, first of all, wasn't built by the Egyptians. There's no evidence that the Egyptians were involved in that at all.
Right.
In fact, they built pyramids much later than that collapsed. They built them at the wrong angle and all.
Correct.
But the Great Pyramid of Giza, he said, existed before the flood, and that it was covered with polished limestone, and the cement that they used to put it together, it was poured vertically 1/50,000th of an inch, the width of a business card.
Right.
And when they were taking this out and removing the facing stones on it, which is just polished like a mirror, that they actually broke the stone because they couldn't break the cement that was used.
Yeah,
they have no idea what it was. And so the cement that they had back then is superior to anything that we've come up with today. And gophering or laminating back then, this again before the flood, and putting together the wood in a floating structure, they were geniuses. They were all geniuses compared to where we are today.
Yeah, we'll have to do a show one time on the pyramids, because I don't find many people that have your perspective, which is the perspective. I have the same perspective, that the Giza Plateau, there's a whole complex, and it was pre-flood in development. And there are certain reasons why it had to be, primarily because of the environment and the alignment and so forth. But anyway, get back to this. One thing I wanted to point out about this, since I have it sitting here, is you can probably easily see the rings in this wood. Okay? And the science of dendrochronology is, of course, counting the rings of trees. People will, cross-section a tree, and they'll count the rings, and they'll get an estimated year, an estimated age of that particular tree. And actually, it's not totally accurate, because the rings are not annual rings, as a lot of people think.
Wet season, dry season.
Wet season, dry season.
Yeah.
Okay, so you may have more than one of those in a year, a solar year. So it's just actually registering that kind of thing. However, so what that means is when you go into Genesis again and you rely on Scripture to give us the insight in terms of the environment, we find that we didn't have the wet, dry seasons like we do today. In fact, the Bible even goes so far to say it never rained. Okay, so what that means is that the wood, the grain of the wood, pre-flood wood, would look much different than this. You wouldn't see the rings in pre-flood wood. You would have a grain. It might resemble the grain of stone or something, but you wouldn't have the rings, because you didn't have those extremes and seasonal changes. That means that somebody came to you and said, Michael, I got a piece of wood from Noah's Ark. Okay, obviously the Ark was built pre-flood. Okay, so using pre-flood material, it'd be quite a trick to use post-flood material on the but at any rate, if somebody brought a piece of wood to you and said, Michael, this is a piece of wood from Noah's Ark, you'd be able to look at it in 10 seconds. You would be able to verify whether it was or not, because when you look at this sample, this on the screen here, you find that it doesn't have the rings.
Right.
Okay, it doesn't have the rings in it.
And I handled that piece and looked at it very carefully. No indication of rings whatsoever, but you could definitely see the different layers in it.
Correct.
And that was the piece that was actually dug up by the command of the governor. Okay, we see it. You go dig it up, and Ron, you have it analyzed. And they cut through this with a stone saw and to reveal the pattern that we see.
Exactly. One of the things that Ron did, actually it's interesting, he did this by hand. Usually when you have a core drilling machine, it's a machine that does all the work, but he took a hand drilling machine in to do this in the side of the ship. And this revealed some very interesting things as well.
Now this is through the side of the ship rather than from the top down.
Through the side, that's correct. And one of the things, of course, was some animal hair. I think you maybe had mentioned that.
Yeah.
Animal hair. And then, of course, the coprolite that he mentioned you find there. Even
coprolite, which is
the fossilized animal dung. Animal dung. And then fossilized broken antlers and things of this nature. And smaller stuff, which is what you would expect to find if the animals were infants or relatively young at that point. So in other words, everything that we would expect to find on a floating zoo is what really has been found there. And I'm wondering if this picture here, you can't probably make the detail out in this too significantly. The reason I wanted to show this was because Greater Ararat and Lesser Ararat are volcanoes. There's a lot of volcanic activity in this area, a lot of seismic activity. When you look at the lava flow, when you look at the recent eruptions and the lava demes and so forth, you can't really probably see it. Maybe they can on the screen there, but when you look at the lava field here, these lava cliffs were cut off pretty abruptly. In other words, lava will flow and it'll level out to a certain extent as it cools. But if something would stop it, it would build up high cliffs. It would just keep building up into a high cliff. And these cliffs down here are actually 100, 150 feet high. Okay, they don't look at it because you're 7,000 feet up in the mountains, but they're actually, you go stand down there, you know, they're 100 feet, 150 feet up in the air. What that tells us is that as the lava came down, it would typically keep going unless something stopped it, right? And what stopped it was the water, all the water that was in the valley there. You see, the lava came down, hit the water, and started to build up because it cooled rapidly. So what this tells us that the whole area was filled with water at one time prior to the eruptions. So the flood first, and then after, you see. So just, again, it creates another time clock for us when we start looking around at the geology of the area. I wanted to come back, you know, what we've looked at thus far is we've looked at a lot of physical evidence, and we've even looked at a lot of circumstantial evidence, like the drogue stones are circumstantial, the altar sites, and there's more than one altar site. Actually, there are altar sites also up in the mountains here, which is where the family would have stayed initially when getting out of the boat. Actually, up here close to the border area, just above this ridge here, the picture on the screen, just above that ridge.
That's a high ridge right at the skyline.
Right at the skyline. Just over that ridge is Iran. You're going into Iranian territory. Okay.
We are right on the edge.
You're right on the edge of the Iranian. Actually, that's about a mile and a half up. Doesn't look like it, but on the ground, it's about a mile and a half up there. At any rate, we've looked at the physical evidence. We've looked at the circumstantial evidence. Something is equally valuable to me and significant is the spiritual significance. I had a group of Kiwis from New Zealand on a tour one year, and we were actually standing or just seated back here on the stern, taking a little break. The sun was lowering a little bit. We were having a time to just get some water and whatnot, and I wanted to really explain to them. I wanted them to catch a vision of how important the spiritual significance was, and to do that, all I had to do was direct their attention up the hill and point out the original landing area. You can pretty much look up the hill and see between ridges, you know, where there's a little harbor up there. In fact, the first time I was there, Michael, I actually just dropped to my knees because it was so like our Heavenly Father to make such a wonderful harbor of safety. And there I was standing right in the middle of it. But what I wanted to share with these guys is that, you know, this thing, because it's impaled here on the side, it means it slid down to this location. All right. So it was up higher. It was about a mile and a half further up the ridge before it slid down. It was broken free by a pyroclastic blast, more than likely, and the lahar and the mud and the lava and all just washed it down. It hit this outcrop and it was impaled. Okay. And then, of course, the mud and all kept coming, and it was buried for a while. We don't know how long, but that would have accelerated the fossilization process. And then at the appropriate time, it was brought forth after an earthquake. And I was explaining this to these guys, and then I asked them, what have I just described? You know, this boat is a symbol of salvation. I mean, it literally not only saved Noah and his family, but all the rest of humanity as well. So, but what have I just described in what's happened to it? Well, our Savior came down from an elevated place from heaven. It was the sin of this world, of course, his love that brought him down here. But he came down in a sinful world, and as an innocent man, he was put on a cross, he was impaled in the side, he was buried, and he came forth after an earthquake. That is astounding to me.
That's incredible.
That the very same thing that our Lord would go through, occurred with this. The very same thing. See, that's part of that evidence. See, that's powerful evidence to me. And to any Christian, that ought to be the most overwhelming evidence that this indeed, I mean, God has his fingerprint all over this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's fantastic.
Well, Jerry, this has been great. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to what we can do in the future on this. Again, if you want to dig deeper into this, let us know on this. But, you know, one thing is the physical evidence, but what Jerry and I were speaking about last night and spending a good bit of time on is not just the physical evidence, because once you grasp that, once you see what the Creator has put in the earth as a testimony in this day and time, then the rest of the story all begins to make sense. From Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22:21, it is all one story. It is His story, Amen. History, and His story is still being told, and the greatest story never told is being brought forth to the world, because today the rocks are crying out.
Absolutely.
Jerry, thanks so much for being with us.